In Genesis chapter 11, we find the story of the Tower of Babel. This chapter takes place after the great flood, when the descendants of Noah had multiplied and settled in the land of Shinar. At this time, all of the people spoke the same language and had a common purpose. They decided to build a city with a tower that would reach the heavens in order to make a name for themselves and prevent being scattered across the earth. The people began constructing the tower using bricks and tar as mortar. They worked diligently, each contributing to the project. However, their intentions were not aligned with God's plan for them. Seeing their defiance, God decided to intervene. He came down to see the city and the tower that the people were building. In verse 6, God said, "Behold, the people is one, and they all have one language, and this they began to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do." So God confused their language, and suddenly the people could no longer understand each other. This caused great confusion and chaos amongst the people, which is where the name Babel is derived. Babel means confusion. The city they were building was abandoned, and it was called Babel. So as a result, the people were scattered across the earth, each group speaking a different language. This event at the Tower of Babel serves as a reminder of the consequences of human pride and disobedience to God. It demonstrates that when people try to exalt themselves above God and pursue their own ambitions without seeking His guidance, they will ultimately face confusion and dispersion. As followers of Christ, we can learn from this story the importance of humility and obedience to God's will. We are called to seek God's guidance in all that we do and align our ambitions with His purpose for our lives. In conclusion, Genesis chapter 11 tells the story of the Tower of Babel, where the people's pride and disobedience led to the confusion of languages and the scattering of humanity. It serves as a reminder for us to humbly submit to God's will and seek His guidance in all aspects of our lives. In Genesis chapter 12, in a land called Ur, there lived a man named Abram. He was a faithful servant of God, and God had a special plan for Abram. One day God spoke to Abram and said, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you." Abram was surprised and unsure of what to do, but he trusted in God's guidance. So he went and gathered his wife, Sarai, and his nephew Lot, and all their possessions, and they set out on a journey to the unknown land that God had promised. As they traveled, you could imagine Abram and his family probably faced many challenges. They probably encountered harsh weather conditions, dangerous animals, and definitely encountered unfamiliar territories. But through it all, Abram remained faithful to God's promise. They finally arrived in the land of Canaan, and God appeared to Abram and said, "This is the land I will give to you and your descendants." Abram then built an altar to worship God. However, a severe famine struck the land, and Abram and his family had to leave Canaan and go to Egypt in search of food. As they entered Egypt, Abram became worried that the Egyptians would kill him and take his beautiful wife, Sarai. So he asked Sarai to pretend to be his sister. Sure enough, when the Egyptians saw Sarai, they were captivated by her beauty and brought her to Pharaoh's palace. Abram was treated well because of Sarai, and he received many gifts from Pharaoh. But God was not pleased with Abram's deception. God sent plagues upon Pharaoh and his household, and Pharaoh realized that Sarai wasn't actually Abram's wife. He confronted Abram and asked him why he had lied. Pharaoh then ordered Abram and his family to leave Egypt immediately. Abram and Sarai returned to Canaan, along with all the wealth that they acquired in Egypt. They settled in the land and continued to worship God faithfully. God blessed Abram with great flocks of sheep, herds of cattle, and many servants. And so the story of Genesis 12 ends with Abram and Sarai, now known as Abraham and Sarah, continuing their journey of faith and obedience to God's plan. Now, little did they know that their descendants would become a great nation, and through them, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And that, my friends, is the story of Genesis chapter 12, a tale of trust, obedience, and the beginning of God's covenant with Abram and his descendants. In Genesis chapter 13, after leaving Egypt, Abraham and his wife Sarah returned to the land of Canaan. They were very wealthy now. However, there was a problem. Both Abraham and his nephew Lot had become so prosperous that the land could not support both of their possessions. Abraham and Lot realized that they needed to separate in order to avoid conflicts between their herdsmen. So Abraham graciously gave Lot first choice of land. Lot looked around and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered and fertile, like the garden of the Lord. He chose to settle there and moved his tents near the city of Sodom. Abraham, on the other hand, chose to stay in the land of Canaan. He settled near the oaks of Mamre, where he built an altar to worship God. God appeared to Abraham and said, "Look around you, as far as you can see in every direction. I am going to give all of this land to you and your descendants forever. Abraham was grateful for God's promise, and he continued to trust in him. He moved his tents and settled near the great trees of Mamre, where he built another altar to worship God. In Genesis chapter 14, after parting ways with his nephew Lot, Abraham continued to live in the land of Canaan. However, trouble was brewing in the city of Sodom, where Lot had chosen to live. The people of Sodom were wicked and sinful before the Lord. Several kings from the east formed an alliance and went to war against the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, as well as the neighboring cities. During the battle, the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah were defeated, and their cities were plundered. Lot, who was living in Sodom at the time, was captured along with all of his possessions. When Abraham heard about Lot's capture, he immediately gathered his trained men, a total of 318, and pursued the kings who had taken his nephew. With a well-executed nighttime attack, assisted by the hand of God, Abraham and his men defeated the enemy forces and rescued Lot, along with all the people and the possessions that had been taken. Upon his return, Abraham was met by two kings, the king of Sodom and Melchizedek, the king of Salem and a priest of God. The king of Sodom offered Abraham all of the recovered possessions as a reward, but Abraham refused to accept anything from him. He didn't want the king of Sodom to claim that he had made Abraham rich. Instead, Abraham gave a tenth of everything he had recovered to Melchizedek, who blessed him in return. Melchizedek was a priest of God Most High and brought out bread and wine to celebrate Abraham's victory. After this encounter, God spoke to Abraham and reassured him of his faithfulness and his protection. He promised to bless Abraham and make him a great nation. Abraham believed in God's promise and continued to trust in him. And so the story of Genesis 14 ends with Abraham's victorious rescue of Lot, his encounter with Melchizedek, and God's reaffirmation of his covenant with Abraham.